Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our final video in the energy unit. We are going to be focusing on a process known as cellular respiration. Now, when we think of the term respiration, we typically think of sorry, I had to belch there. I'm not belching, but breathing, right? Respiration is involved with breathing, and we're going to find out that that is not necessarily the case. The process of cellular respiration is simply the process to convert the glucose that is either made by photosynthesis or ingested when we eat certain foods, and converting that into usable ATP, or usable energy, that is found inside of the body. So let's take a look at that process and how that happens in a variety of different organisms. So by the end of this video, you should be able to explain the purpose of cellular respiration. You should also be able to differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And again, much like with the process of photosynthesis, be able to explain the full equation for the process of cellular respiration. We've got a few different vocab terms that are here, including cellular respiration, glycolysis, electron transport chain, aerobic, anaerobic, the Krebs cycle, and pyruvate. Now again, this is just like with photosynthesis, this is a very simplistic version of this process. This is really meant for an introductory biology class. So if you're looking for a little more complex way of going through this, I have some other videos on my YouTube channel that go through this process in a little bit more detail. So again, cellular respiration is the release of chemical energy to generate ATP. And that's the whole goal of this process. We're looking at making adenosine triphosphate from the glucose and then converting that into usable energy that can be used inside of the cell. Aerobic respiration requires oxygen. Now, you've probably heard the term aerobic exercise before. The term aerobic just means that it requires oxygen. So when you're doing aerobic exercise, you're breathing really heavily. You're taking in lots of oxygen that's necessary. So that's where the term aerobic comes from. Now, anaerobic does not require oxygen. So there are really two different types of respiration here, aerobic and anaerobic. Now you'll find that aerobic respiration is utilized in those organisms that have mitochondria. So you're looking at basically all eukaryotic organisms with a few exceptions. Anaerobic respiration would be primarily used by organisms that do not have mitochondria. So things that are prokaryotic, like bacteria and whatnot. So keep these in mind as we go through this process. Now, here's the formula for aerobic respiration. Again, it's one that you're going to need to make sure that you memorize, similar to the photosynthesis equation. Glucose plus oxygen are used to generate carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. And if you think about it, this makes sense. The glucose inside of our body reacts with the oxygen that we breathe in. We breathe out carbon dioxide, a little bit of water is produced in that, and then we are able to generate ATP. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this is it's very similar to photosynthesis. In fact, it's almost the exact opposite of photosynthesis in terms of the reactants and products. If you remember, in photosynthesis, our reactants are light, carbon dioxide, and water. Very similar to that of the products of respiration. If you remember, the products of photosynthesis were glucose and oxygen, which are also the reactants of the process of cellular respiration. So really the whole goal of, if you think of photosynthesis and respiration, the only thing that really changes is that we start with light and then we end up with ATP at the end. So it's a really fascinating process, but what's nice is if you know one, you really know the other. You just need to flip your reactants and products and realize that we're not making light, we're making ATP. So, step number one of this whole process, and there are 3 steps to the process of aerobic respiration, but aerobic and anaerobic have the same first step, and that is glycolysis. In glycolysis, glucose is broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules that are called pyruvate. Now, in order to break the glucose molecule down, this costs 2 ATP, but it actually generates 4 for a net of 2 ATP. So out of this process, we're able to break down glucose into pyruvate and gain 2 ATP from the process. Now, if this organism performs anaerobic respiration, then you're done. This is the only process in anaerobic respiration. So per 1 glucose molecule in anaerobic respiration, we generate 2 ATP. If our organism performs aerobic respiration, we move on to the next step. The reason the next steps are for aerobic only is that both steps require oxygen and the presence of a mitochondria. In step number 2, Pyruvate is broken down even further into carbon dioxide, hydrogen, again through NADPH and FADH, and some high energy electrons. Now again, this process requires oxygen to take place and generates 2 more ATP. This also occurs inside of the mitochondria. So as you see, the Krebs cycle is a much more complex process. But the key thing to keep in mind is that we'll break down pyruvate even more into some simpler molecules, such as carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and some high energy electrons. And through this process, we generate 2 more ATP molecules. The last step, which is known as the money step, is that those hydrogen ions and high energy electrons generate a large amount of ATP. They use something that's called ATP synthase. More specifically, it's a hydrogen ion pump. And when the hydrogen moves through this molecule, or when hydrogen moves through this protein, it generates quite a bit of ATP. So from this process, we actually generate 32 ATP from this particular step. So this is the one where most of the ATP is made. Now you'll notice here, this particular process is actually made across the matrix of the mitochondria. If you remember, the interior of the mitochondria looks a lot like a maze. It has a lot of folds in it, and that's really important because the more folds there are in the inner matrix of the mitochondria, the more surface area is present in order to be able to move hydrogen ions and generate ATP. So that matrix plays a really important role in generating high amounts of ATP inside of the mitochondria that are necessary to produce energy for the cell itself. So in order to break this down in a little bit more detail here, the first step is glycolysis, and we make 2 ATP from that process by taking glucose and breaking it down into pyruvate, and we get a bunch of high energy electrons from that. If we're anaerobic, we're done. This is the only process that occurs, and we get 2 ATP from this process. If we're aerobic, we move on to the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle. We make 2 more ATP by breaking down pyruvate into carbon dioxide, some hydrogen, and some more high energy electrons. At the very last step, we generate 32 ATP by moving those hydrogen ions and electrons across the membrane of the matrix of the mitochondria. And as a result of that, we produce 32 ATP. So in summary, this is a really good chart to help us understand what's going on. In anaerobic, reactants are glucose, and the combustion is completely incomplete. The reactants are glucose, and the combustion is incomplete. We only yield 2 ATP from this process. Now, what's interesting is that if we don't have enough oxygen inside of our body, we will only perform glycolysis. The rest of aerobic respiration will not occur. Well, if you take a look at the products underneath animals, lactic acid is produced from the products of anaerobic respiration if we don't have enough oxygen. If you remember correctly, when we work out and our muscles and all that stuff, and we don't have enough oxygen, we start to cramp up. Those cramps are due to excess amounts of lactic acid buildup inside of the muscle cells. So you can kind of see why lactic acid kind of makes sense in this process. The location of anaerobic respiration is the cytoplasm, and the stages are pretty much glycolysis. In aerobic respiration, however, we use glucose and oxygen. The presence of oxygen allows for the complete combustion of the glucose molecule. As a result of this, we generate a net gain of 36 ATP, and our products are carbon dioxide and water. The location of this is in the cytoplasm as well as the mitochondria, and the stages for this include glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So this is a really good tool for you to use to make sure that you can differentiate between the 2 processes that occur inside of the body. And again, we'll review this in a little more detail when we come back to class next time. So just a little bit about this process, and hopefully this is just kind of the gist of it. The cellular respiration is how cells generate ATP. Anaerobic does not require oxygen, while aerobic does. And as a result, this generates a variety of different ATP. In anaerobic respiration, mitochondria are the primary organelle that is involved with this process. So hopefully you've got a little bit of an understanding. Again, I know this is a complex process, but bear with me as we continue to work through it, continue to build on these key concepts, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next time. We'll have a great day, guys, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.